My name is Ramachandran, and I am at the University of California, San Diego, in La Jolla, and at the Salk Institute. And I was born and raised in India. I was originally educated as a physician, and then obtained a PhD in visual neuroscience, visual neurophysiology, and studied perception, and then got into neurology, which is what I've been doing for the last 10 years. So I have two labs, one of which focuses on behavioral neurology or cognitive neuroscience, looking at patients who have sustained damage to different parts of the brain, and the other lab focuses on just human vision, visual psychophysics. I talked about two different topics, both of which are often regarded as what you might call human singularities in human evolution. That is language, which is uniquely human for the most part, and visual art, which again, by and large, is human. Although you wonder about bowerbirds, which create very elaborate.
Create the little, yeah.
Well, actually not little, sometimes huge.
Huge, right.
Yeah, enormous bowers, and often decorate them with beads and colored bits of feathers and pebbles, and sometimes even shiny bits of foil and things like that. So it's like they're fond of jewelry.
It's a full art installation that they.
It's like installation art. If you didn't tell somebody that this is done by a bowerbird,
it could easily, yeah.
it could easily fit into any Madison Avenue art gallery, you know. So anyway, so first half of my talk was about a phenomenon called synesthesia, where people, when they listen to certain tones, they experience specific colors, like C sharp, for example, may be red. Another tone might be blue. A third tone might be yellow. So this is the blending of the senses, and we call it synesthesia. Okay. Or sometimes they will look at specific numbers, like 5 is red, 6 is green. You're presenting them in black and white, but they'll say 5 is red, 6 is blue, 7 is beige, 8 is yellow, whatever. Of course, the colors are not the same for different synesthetes. Now, this was originally described by Galton, and since then there have been hundreds of case studies, but people have thought of it as a curiosity. Well, first of all, people thought it was very rare, and it turns out that that's not true. We have found 1 in 200 people as a synesthete. And although it's been known for a long time, it's been ignored by the establishment, by mainstream neuroscience, mainstream perceptual psychophysics, and people have thought of it as just as a curiosity, because it doesn't make any sense. What do you mean when somebody, when somebody tells you that C sharp is red? What does that mean? And Galton also noticed that it runs in families. Now, how detailed an account do you want?
No, it's
okay.
great. Okay, so
it runs in families, so it may be a genetic basis, and number of theories have been proposed to explain for this. One idea is that they're just crazy, because it doesn't make any sense. And the second idea is that maybe they're just on acid, on LSD. And this is true because some people who take LSD report synesthetic experiences. Yeah? But that doesn't mean that's all it is. Thirdly, you find that, the third theory is that these people are just being, they're just remembering childhood memories. In other words, they were playing with refrigerator magnets.
Ah, okay.
So colored,
Sure.
5 was red, 6 was blue, 7 was yellow, and they're stuck with these memories. And this doesn't make any sense to me, because why does it run in families then? So you have to start saying that maybe the propensity to play with magnets runs in families or something like that. It doesn't make any sense. Okay. Another theory is they're just being metaphorical, just as you and I might say hot bab, or, that's just a metaphor. Or you say cheddar cheese is sharp. Cheese isn't sharp. You rub it on your skin, it's soft. So why do you say sharp? Well, you say, no, you see, what you mean is the taste is sharp. But why are you using a tactile adjective to describe a taste experience? There seems to be a confusion of categories here. And I was not happy with this explanation because it's an example of trying to explain one mystery with another mystery, which never works in science. That is, you're taking synesthesia, it's spooky, it's mysterious, we don't know what it is, and you're saying, oh, well, it's just a metaphor. But we don't know what a metaphor is. How is a metaphor represented in the brain? So it doesn't help to say that synesthesia is just a metaphor. And in fact, what I've done is to turn it upside down completely and argue that synesthesia is a concrete sensitive phenomenon. You can understand its physiological basis, find out what's going on in the brain, and that in turn gives you a foothold, an experimental foothold or lever for understanding more complex mental phenomena like metaphor and creativity and imagination. And that's what the talk was about.
So how have you tested this? How have you found, or what have you done to try to correlate the experience of a green 5 in the brain? You know,
Well, it turns out to be very tricky because, well, first of all, we wanted to show that the phenomenon is genuine. It's a real phenomenon worthy of study, and it's not that the people are being crazy or they're just being metaphorical or something like that. And people have been trying to do this since Galton's time, and there have been 1 or 2 experiments. What we did was to find 2 synesthetes who had number color synesthesia. 5 was red and 2 was green in one of them. Mm-hmm. The other was 5 was blue and 2 was yellow, say. And then we created a random matrix of 2s. And if you think about computerized 2s, they're mirror images of 5.
okay,
Right?
sure.
So you scatter these 2s on the screen, and then embedded in the forest of 2s are a few 5s. Okay? Mm-hmm. And they're scattered there, and they form some sort of global shape, like a triangle or a circle. Now, if you and I look at it, you just see
A
bunch of squiggles.
but they should see colors,
Right.
differentials.
Differentials. Now, you can measure the time it takes for a normal person to detect that global embedded shape, and it's a half a second or a second or 2, because they have to search for it. And they say, oh, this looks slightly different. Oh, it's a 5, not a 2.
Right.
It's a mirror image. Oh, here's another one, here's another one. And then they mentally cluster these together, and they say, it's a triangle. On the other hand, the synesthete looks at it and says, oh, I see a red triangle. It's jumping out at me.
That quickly.
Yeah. Well, much more quickly
Much
than.
more.
And we've seen this in most of the synesthetes we've tested. So in other words, here's something they're better at than normal people. So how can they be making it up? How can they be confabulating?
Right.
And how can it be just memory association or metaphor? This shows it's an authentic sensory experience. They're literally seeing those 5s as red, so they're able to instantly group it together. It pops out at them. Okay? So what you have is a test for synesthesia, a clinical test, like the Ishihara test for colorblindness. Okay? Okay, so that was the first step. The next step is what's going on, where is it in the brain? And we looked at brain atlases, and one of the things we found was, if you look at the fusiform gyrus in the temporal lobes in the sides of the brain, in the inner sides of the temporal lobes is the fusiform gyrus, that's where the color area of the brain is, discovered by Semir Zeki, where the cells are responsive to color.
Right.
And it turns out that the visual number area for visual graphemes of numbers is right next to it, almost touching it. So we said, my God, what a coincidence that the most common type of synesthesia is the number color synesthesia, and the number and color area almost touching each other. So we think maybe there's some cross-wiring going on in these people. And remember I said it runs in families. So the idea is that maybe some people have a gene mutation that causes defective pruning between adjacent parts of the brain. Because the fetus and the young infant is born with excess connections. And you whittle away, you prune away the excess connections to create the characteristic modular organization of the adult brain. It's like Michelangelo creating David
away.
by chipping away everything that doesn't look like David. Now, if the mutation then selectively expresses itself in the fusiform, then you get defective pruning in the fusiform. And you're going to get cross connection between V4, the color area, and the number area. So anytime you stimulate a number, it's going to evoke some color, hence synesthesia. Another related experiment, we find, for example, the number, if you just change the contrast of the number, and if you have a black 5 on a white background, you just change the contrast. Below a certain contrast, you don't see the color, the synesthete, even though you can still perfectly clearly see the number. Now, this degree of sensitivity to simple sensory parameters like contrast, again, points to an early sensory process as opposed to some high-level memory association, because after all, he can still see the number. Why wouldn't he say, I played with a magnet, it must be red, So that nailed it down as a sensory phenomenon. But then we then found there are some other, by the way, we're now testing this using functional magnetic resonance imaging, FMR. A student of mine, Ed Hubbard, is looking at synesthetes and looking at normal people. And if you present numbers to synesthete, the question is, do you get any activation in the color area, even though the number is presented in black and white? So he's starting to look at that. We don't have any results yet. I mean, we have some preliminary results in the right direction, but not statistically significant yet. And that's very important, I think, in brain imaging studies, because there is now, as you know, it's almost like an epidemic, and everybody's doing brain imaging. And unfortunately, 99% of it is just phrenology. Gee whiz, let's see what lights up. And that's fun to do. It's not a waste of time, because sometimes you stumble on something by accident, But I think the way to go is to make specific predictions about what you're going to find and where in the brain. And then do specific psychophysical experiments and make predictions, and then go look for that in the brain. And this would be an example of that if it works. What we've done so far is simply called psychophysics. That is, you treat the system as a black box, and you present different types of visual patterns, manipulate the patterns, you ask what the subject sees, and then you draw inferences and construct models about what's going on.
Gotcha. So basically, you didn't actually see, using, I guess, MRI, you didn't see the area of color and the area of numbers light up.
We did, but we have not then taken the next step, and we saw them light up, and we saw they're right next to each other, and almost touching, but we haven't taken the next step of then taking a synesthete and seeing if lighting just one up causes the other to light up as well. That's the obvious next step.
Okay.
Okay.
What happens if you show the synesthete a green 5, but they usually see blue 5s? Do they convert it to blue?
No, that's a good question. If you show it to them in the wrong color, yes, they do convert it, quote unquote, convert it. What they see is they see it in layers. They simultaneously see the wrong color, which is, you've displayed it in the wrong color, but they also see the synesthetically induced color, and they say it feels unpleasant. They'll say, ugh, it's hideous. There's a disproportionate aversive reaction to this, and I'll explain why in a minute. There's another piece of the puzzle.
They don't mix red and blue into purple, though?
They never do that. Or red and green into yellow or whatever. Now, what's interesting is that the first two synesthetes we stumbled on are what we call sensory synesthetes, or simple synesthetes. And we were lucky because they were easy to study. And this cross-wiring, we think, is happening very early in the hierarchy of sensory information processing. But then we came across synesthetes where it wasn't just the visual appearance of the 5, even the concept would trigger the color. So for example, in our first two synesthetes, if you show them the Roman 5, there is no color. If you show them 5, the Arabic Indian 5, they would say, oh, that looks red. But the Roman 5, they would say, well, I know it's a 5, but it doesn't produce a color.
Strange.
Yeah, now that again shows it's not the concept that's driving it, but the early sensory representation in the fusiform gyrus. Because what's in the fusiform gyrus is the visual representation, not the concept.
Right, okay.
Okay.
So the concept is something to do with some memory capacity somewhere else, perhaps, or it's an association.
That's correct. Or
they'll associate it with the
numerical concept,
right?
Whatever that is. Okay.
We don't know where that is occurring.
I'm coming to that.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
We then stumbled on a couple of synesthetes who not only would Roman 5s elicit colors, but they would say days of the week are colored. Monday is red, Tuesday is blue, Wednesday is chartreuse, Thursday is beige or whatever. And December is yellow, January is purple, February, okay. No wonder people thought they were crazy, okay? But there's a pattern here, because they don't say tables and chairs are colored, right? So there's a pattern. So whenever you think somebody is crazy, look more carefully. And this phenomenon has been known for a long time. The pattern is, what do numbers have in common with days of the week and weeks of months of the year?
They're all concepts of numbers, right?
Numerical sequence or ordinality. And that we think is represented, this is a conjecture, in the region of the angular gyrus of the human brain, in the left hemisphere. We think that because when that's damaged, you get dyscalculias, problems with elementary numerical calculation. So that
1
we
plus
think,
1 equals 4.
usually they don't do problems with arithmetic because that's overlearned. But if you say 20 minus 3, he'll say 12. So
Okay.
subtraction is very difficult. Division is impossible. Multiplication, again, by rote, they've learned it, so it's overlearned. So it doesn't require the conceptual juggling.
Okay.
So they can do that. But anyway, so we think angular gyrus is involved in numerical calculation. And interestingly, Zeki's next color area in the sequence, where more sophisticated color processing occurs, is right next to that region. Now, imagine if this gene, instead of being expressed in the fusiform, the mutated gene, this hyperconnectivity gene, okay, or defective pruning gene, if it's expressed higher up because of transcription factors in the region of the angular gyrus, then the cross-wiring is going to happen here. And then you get what I call a higher synesthete, concept-driven synesthete, instead of a lower synesthete who is driven by the visual appearance.
But people must have a combination of the two as well.
There are
Whole spectrum.
well, I don't know about whole spectrum, but you do see people who are mixed types.
And one doesn't trigger the upper, per se?
It's complicated by the fact that some of the upper types, for example, they can visualize the number. And once they visualize, they're creating a partial activation within the fusiform, and that can drive the color percept. But the general answer to your question is we think there are two ends of a spectrum, the higher types and the lower types. There are probably types in between. One of the things people have observed about synesthetes is that synesthesia is much more common among artists, poets, and novelists, about 7 or 8 times more common according to one study. Now, not everybody believes this, and it only fueled the suspicion further that they're just crazy, because as you know, artists are all crazy, you know. Okay, so, but we think this is a genuine phenomenon, and the question is, why does it happen? And I have an explanation for that, and the explanation is, if the same gene, instead of expressing itself locally in the fusiform or in the angular gyrus, expresses more diffusely throughout the brain, then you get hyperconnectivity throughout the brain, okay? Lots of excess connections. Now, what is a metaphor? Let's think about it. A metaphor, you say, it is the east and Juliet is the sun.
Gotcha. So basically, it's a triggering of
Associations.
associations.
Yeah. In other words, you don't say Juliet is the sun, you don't say, well, she's just a ball of fire.
Right.
You say she's warm like the sun, nurturing like the sun, radiant like the sun. Your brain develops all the right links. And Shakespeare, of course, was a master at this. Mm-hmm. Now, if you then accept that concepts are also represented in brain maps, and we know they are, for example, with a stroke, you can lose just the idea of tools and nothing else. Right. Vegetables and nothing else, even though tools have nothing visually in common.
What was that again? A stroke, would you say?
A stroke.
A stroke.
Yeah.
You
lose the concept of tools, for example. There are many old neurological case studies along those lines. Okay, so if concepts are represented in brain maps, and a metaphor is linking two seemingly unrelated conceptual realms, okay, then if you have excess connections throughout the brain, it facilitates the linking of seemingly unrelated concepts, which is the basis of all metaphor and creative human thought. Synesthetes have more of these connections, so they're more likely to be poets or artists or novelists, okay? Now,
not scientists, though?
creative scientists, especially visual scientists. Okay. Feynman had synesthesia. Maybe Einstein. You see, there are 3 or 4 theories of language. One theory is that it's so complex, so sophisticated, involves so many interlocking bits and pieces. How do you evolve such an elaborate, sophisticated system through natural selection? The Dawkins type, Darwin type, blind watchmaker, you know. Well, Wallace says, Darwin's contemporary says, it can't be done. It was done through divine intervention. God put language in the human brain. And that's not an answer. Right? Second answer comes from Chomsky, who says, look, it just can't be done by natural selection. It's too sophisticated, too elaborate, okay? Especially the aspect of language he emphasized and discovered, that is the hierarchy, the hierarchical syntactic structure of the language syntactic tree, you know, the nested structure of language.
Word, sentence, paragraph, that kind of thing?
That's correct, yeah.
And even words coupled to make, okay.
Yeah. Noun phrases, all of the, you know, what we call the syntactic structure tree. You know.
Sure, okay.
It's so sophisticated that the way it evolved is, God knows what happens when you put 100 billion nerve cells in such a tiny space. Maybe new laws of physics emerge. Certainly new emergent properties. And language is one such emergent property which we don't yet understand. In other words, he's saying a miracle happens. Now, this comes perilously close to Wallace's theory, although he doesn't say God. It's saying there's a miracle of some kind. The third possibility is the one raised by Stephen Jay Gould. He says language is the deployment of a more general ability towards communication. In other words, we evolve thought, thinking, the ability to manipulate symbols in your mind, and then a specific deployment of that ability in the context of communication we call language. So just as we evolved fingers, in other words, he said you didn't evolve language specifically for communication. Just as you evolved fingers, right, for climbing trees, but now you can use them to count and compute and do mathematics. And most mathematical systems have a base 10. It's simply because we've got 10 fingers. There's no other deep reason, okay? So similarly, so nobody would argue that fingers evolved to do math, obviously not. Similarly, no one should argue that language evolved from communication. He argues that thinking evolved and then it was an exaptation for language. And I think that's wrong too. And one of the reasons I don't like it is because, again, he's trying to solve one mystery with another mystery. How did language evolve? Oh, simple, it evolved from thought. thinking is even more complicated. How did it evolve? How did it evolve? So you're only postponing the problem. Okay? Finally, there's Pinker who says, oh, there's no big problem here. It evolved through natural selection. But I don't know how exactly it happened. But it's a specific adaptation for communication. And I disagree with that too. And I think what happened was a series of exaptations, in other words, things which would evolve for other reasons, were then, there was an opportunistic adaptation of those mechanisms for language and communication. How did that happen? Okay? And to understand that, you have to look at certain funny visual shapes, and I don't know how you're going to do that. I can draw it for you later.
My head will probably work fine.
If you have an amoeba-like shape, like that, okay, versus a shape that's got jagged edges like a piece of shattered glass, and you show them side by side to somebody, any person, and you say, this is Martian alphabet. I've drawn these on the screen. These are my, one of them is Booba, the other is Kiki. Tell me which is Booba, which is Kiki. Because you made that up, it's not Martian, okay? 99 out of 100 people in the audience will pick the undulating shape. They'll say, that's Booba. And the sharp, jagged thing, they'll say, is Kiki. Although you never taught them. Now, how do they know that? This proves in my mind that we're all synesthetes. We're all closet synesthetes, but we don't know it. We're in denial. And the reason is, the gentle visual undulation of the contour in the amoeba mimics the auditory representation, Booba.
Nice rounded.
Yeah. Whereas the sharp, jagged edges, the visual sudden inflection, mimics the sharp ki of the sound.
Sawtooth wavelengths, actually.
Exactly.
In
Not
music.
to mention the tongue hitting the palate sharp versus Booba, the undulation of the tongue and lips, mimicking the visual appearance, okay? So there is a non-arbitrary mapping, synesthetic mapping, between visual form and auditory phonemic representation. This is very important in the evolution of language. How did the first words evolve? Did people get together and say, oh, let's call that a microphone. Let's call that let's all say together, microphone. Of course not, right? What happened was there was a little bias in certain directions of production of sound for certain object shapes. Now, it's a very tiny bias, but that's all you need in evolution, because once you have that, you get the bootstrapping.
Snowball effect, yep.
Exactly. Now, there's also a mapping between auditory cortex, so this is between vision and hearing. But hearing and mouth-lip movements in the Broca's area, which are represented as motor maps. That's why you say, diminutive, teeny-weeny, un peu, okay? Your lips, tongue, and mouth mimic the miniature size of what you're looking at. So there's a synesthetic correspondence between what your lips, tongue are literally doing and what you're looking at. Versus enormous, large, okay? Now, all this sounds comical, but
Got test tube.
it's amazing how a tiny bias of that kind can get amplified across generations. Now comes the best part. If you look at the motor map in the brain, the Penfield map, the tongue, lips, and mouth are right next to the hands. Now, why is that interesting? It's interesting because Darwin pointed out that when you cut with a pair of scissors, you do this. You clench and unclench unconsciously. In other words, there is what I call a synkinesia, like synesthesia, that the motor activity in the tongue and mouth regions unconsciously mimics the hand movements. Okay, and why that happens is a whole another question. But clearly there's some spillover. Okay. Given that that's true, imagine our ancestral hominids trying to describe something small. And they do this, a pincer. And then they say, diminutive, teeny-weeny. The lips and tongue do exactly the same thing, mimicking this. And then your ancestral primate makes some grunt or howl or groan using its right hemisphere for emotional vocalization, which is very easy to evolve, through the cingulate gyrus, and that's going to go through your lips and tongue, which now are mimicking your hand gesture. So already there's a built-in translation of your gestural language into the language of vocalization, which in turn, combined with the guttural utterances, emotional cries of the right hemisphere, produces the first proto-words. So now you've got a four-way bootstrapping, okay?
All right.
Giving rise to the early evolution of language. Then you somehow link that to aspects of semantics, and you have the final emergence of language. Now, think of what you've just done. You've taken, this is typical of our strategy in our lab. You take a spooky phenomenon, which has been regarded as a curiosity, an anomaly, people saying 5 is red, and people have ignored it for 100 years. You bring it to the laboratory, show it's a real phenomenon, and then guess what? It has vast implications for almost every aspect of human nature. Like what is metaphor,
what is thought, how did language evolve. If you get a large enough family, you can even clone the gene, go from the gene, which I call the hyperconnectivity gene, to the specific brain area, fusiform gyrus for lower synesthetes, angular gyrus for higher synesthetes, do the visual psychophysics, perceptual experiments, like the pop-out experiment, then point out its link. You can do functional brain imaging, okay? And then point out its relevance to metaphor, Shakespeare, evolution of language, the whole spectrum, all in one preparation.
I have a question for you then.
Yeah.
Couldn't you reverse engineer this entire concept and go for the Dr. Dolittle effect, where you can look at a wolf howling at the moon and basically interpret its language?
You could, especially now that you have this framework, this novel framework. By the way, I want to say that many of the fragments of this puzzle have been lying around. What we've tried to do is to simply
Connect them.
and create a coherent framework for understanding language and evolution of language. We can now look at aphasias, for example, from this perspective. So, for example, you're damaged to angular gyrus in the left hemisphere. What we find is some of these people can't do bubakiki anymore.
All right.
Okay? So the angular gyrus is playing a critical role in this type of cross-modal synesthesia. And think about this. The angular gyrus of the left hemisphere, if it's really doing this bubakiki thing, think about what that entails. You've got visual undulation versus auditory undulation, and they have nothing in common. Here's a pattern of sounds, and here's a visual thing. If you're a mathematician, you say immediately, no, they obviously have a great deal in common if you look at Fourier space. I mean, there's the same undulation, the same sound undulation.
Okay.
But in reality, they have very little in common out there in the physical world. So this cross-modal synesthesia is the beginning of what we call abstraction. So what I'm arguing is synesthesia is the basis of all abstraction. That's how it's got started in human evolution. And once that was achieved, and the angular gyrus was specialized for this, then you could start using it for all sorts of other types of metaphor and thinking and that sort of thing. Okay? And this often happens in evolution, where one structure evolved for one purpose and it becomes an exaptation for a totally novel function. Predicting forward, I mean, the only thing I can say is that it obviously, this is almost, I don't want to sound like a new age guru type thing, but training people with metaphors, basically poetry and visual art, at a very early age is extremely important and very neglected in the modern curriculum, in education in both elementary school and middle school and high school. And one could see accelerating the pace of culture gene coevolution by emphasizing that. Spatial representations of numbers, for example, which many great mathematicians engage in that.
How does that work?
Well, there's such a thing as a number line, you see. So there are some synesthetes where each 5 is here, 6 is here, 7 is here, 8 is here, 9 is here, and they've got a convoluted line. And I strongly believe that mathematicians have numerical, spatial representation of numbers too. And this somehow makes it easier for them to do certain types of computation.
Because when they have to relate one to the other
That's right.
or multiply one, they have points in space to refer to.
That's
and
correct.
It's immediate. Okay.
That's correct. So it's a form of metaphorical thinking, but this is a little bit far out. I mean, we haven't got there yet.
If evolution favored metaphorical thinking or connections, why would we, as we got older, lose those connections that we start with?
That's an interesting question. The way to approach it is to say that, you see, the connections are random in infancy, and then you minimize them and eliminate them. But for metaphorical associations, even though I simplified it by saying everything is connected to everything, it's not a random connection. There is non-arbitrary links which are being strengthened.
All right.
And that's what makes it easier for these people to engage in metaphorical thinking. But there may be a penalty paid for that too. I mean, you may be a creative thinker, but the corollary of that is certain types of very systematic, logical, modular thinking may be not as efficiently done. I have been emphasizing the genetic aspects because of the empirical finding that synesthesia runs in families. And I was pointing out its relevance to artistic ability because of the higher incidence of synesthesia among artists. But this doesn't mean that given a propensity towards synesthesia, a propensity to develop these associations, that this does not require an environment where this is encouraged and nurtured, versus if you're exposed to an environment where this is not emphasized, even though these connections may be there, you are not reinforced for it, and it might just not be used, or it might get degraded, in some way. So there's no contradiction between the nature-nurture, aspects of this problem. You could say, as a biologist, I'm interested in the genetic aspects, but clearly,
Doesn't, it's
on
not
top
mutual,
of,
they're not
they're not
mutually
mutually
exclusive.
exclusive.
Okay.
Exactly.
All right. So, and you're moving into art then, and
Yeah.
so dovetailing into art.
Yeah.
What does that mean? Now, artists are all starving. So, how is that a genetic advantage or an evolutionary
No.
advantage?
Okay, it's very important. See, there are two separate questions. One is, why do people engage in art? Does that have an evolutionary advantage? And here, I don't know, but I would think probably not. I mean, I think there are people like Miller and others who have argued that, and this is pop evolutionary psychology, where they argue that you're good with eye-hand coordination. If you're an artist, you must be very good with wielding your brush, and that in turn means you're good at wielding a sword and you've got good eye-hand coordination. And I think that's silly. It just sounds so superficial if you think about it. And as I said in my talk, it's like saying, if that's true, how come men are not very good at knitting? Because that also requires a lot of coordination, or threading a needle for that matter, or embroidery.
Right. Okay.
I mean, why art, right? But there's another question, and that is, are there artistic universals? In other words, despite the cultural differences, are there some types of patterns which people find pretty? And if so, obviously the only reason you produce them is because it more optimally excites parts of your brain and makes you feel happy. For example, music. We didn't evolve to appreciate music, but the way our brain circuits are organized, it so happens that music is enjoyable. And the same is true for many aspects of visual art. So our question is not why art evolved, but what is the artist doing with his images to excite certain areas in your brain more optimally than you could do with just wandering around the world or looking at photographs, thereby heightening your aesthetic experience of the world. In other words, how does the artist heighten your aesthetic experience of the world? Not why did art evolve? They're two different questions. I'm not talking so much about music as about visual art. Some of these principles may apply to music eventually. But I'm talking about visual art, and I gave the example of, well, the first thing to understand is art is not about realism, not about copying something, because then you can just walk around and look at things around you. Why do you need art?
Sure, it's a metaphorical abstraction, right?
It's an abstraction, but metaphorical is one type of abstraction, but you also do other types of tricks with the image to enhance your aesthetic appreciation, not just metaphor. Metaphor is one of this list of what I call the 9 laws of. Metaphor is just one of the long list of artistic universals, which I call the 9 laws of art. Okay. And in many ways, the most interesting one is visual metaphor. For example, in Indian art, you have women, a statue of a goddess with big breasts and very narrow, slim waist, and then there is a branch on top of her with mangoes. And this is not an accident. They put them there deliberately because she is a symbol of the fecundity and fertility of youthfulness with her breasts, okay? The fecundity and fertility of nature. But so is this branch of the mangoes. It's a symbol of fertility and spring and all of that. Not to mention the mangoes themselves are a visual echo of her breasts. So you're getting multiple resonances and multiple layers of metaphorical associations being set up in the brain, and that's very harmonious and pleasing, okay? But then going back to the other principles, let me just mention one or two. One principle is the principle that I call principle of hyper stimulation, okay? And the best way to understand that is to look at another principle called peak shift. And that's known from work on rats. If you show a rat a rectangle and a square and you give it a piece of cheese for the rectangle, it'll learn to go to the rectangle. But now, if you give it a long, skinny rectangle, it prefers that to the original rectangle you taught the rat.
Even though he knows there's cheese associated with the original one.
Exactly. So why does he prefer that? Well, the reason he prefers it is because he has learned to rule rectangularity. The more rectangular, the better. So he looks at this and he says, wow, what a rectangle.
Because it looks less like a mousetrap? I don't know.
Well, it's because it's going even further away along that dimension from a square.
Okay.
Okay, but so the rectangle is a prototype, and then you're going away in the same dimension. Okay, now, what you do in visual art, for example, in caricature or in portraiture, what you do is you take somebody's face, like Nixon's face. How do you create a caricature? You take the mean of all male faces, you subtract that from Nixon's face, and that tells you what's special, his eyebrows and nose, and then you amplify it, exaggerate it.
Okay, right, sure.
And then you get something that looks even more like Nixon than Nixon himself, okay? Now all that is fine, and you can do the same thing with the female form, big breasts, big hips, narrow waist, and all of that, okay? But here's the point that I think has been missed, and it's not obvious, and that is, if you look at seagulls, the mother seagull has a long beak with a red spot. It's a yellow beak with a red spot, okay? It looks like a beak, like that. The baby pecks at that red spot, begs for food. The mother then regurgitates half-digested food into the gaping mouth of the chick. Chick swallows it and is happy. Timbergen discovered that. Next question is, how does the chick, as soon as it hatches, recognize its mother? Why doesn't it go beg food from a donkey? Well, then Timbergen found you can pluck the beak and wave this disembodied beak in front of the chick will still beg for food. Because it's trying to simplify computation. It's saying the only time I'll see this long thing with a red spot when there's a mother seagull attached. I'm never going to see a malicious ethologist waving a beak in front of me, okay?
Did they do that like the first thing the bird saw or the chick saw when it came out of the egg? Was that? And it did
No,
it?
it's a hardwired innate thing. Even if it's not the first thing, it'll go for it.
But I mean, if it is the first thing,
Then
and there's no mother bird attached to it,
It'll still go
do
for
it.
it.
So
It'll
it's hard. It's a genetic
It's
hardwired
hardwired,
thing.
yeah.
Okay.
But now comes the best part. If Timbergen takes a stick with a red spot, the chick still goes for it. It gets fooled. And that's because the receptor fields which are processing the beak, the neurons in the chick's brain, they're not that fussy. It's a biological system. They're not designed to be optimal. They're designed to be adequate.
Right.
Okay, if it's good enough beak, then I'll fire. Okay?
Okay.
Right. Now comes the best part. What Timbergen found is we take a long, thin stick with 3 red stripes. Nobody knows why he tried this, but just fooling around. The chick then goes crazy. It pecks at the beak incessantly, can't stop pecking. It prefers that to the real mother. Okay? Why? Because he has stumbled on a super beak, what I call a hyper stimulus. And that is, he has found a thing which activates that receptor field in the neuron even more than a natural beak because of the way it's wired up. Now, it may have some funny rule like the more red outline, the better. Maybe that's the best way to wire it up. Okay? Now, normally that doesn't matter because nature is never going to see a beak, striped beak, right? But here you can fool it. You can give it this long thing with the 3 red stripes and it goes crazy.
Okay.
It says, wow, what a sexy beak. And it goes for it, okay? Now, that's my punchline about art in general. And that is, if the seagulls had an art gallery, they would take this long stick with the 3 red stripes, they'd hang it on a wall, they'd call it a Picasso, they'd pay millions of dollars for it, they'd worship it, but not understand why, because it doesn't look like anything. Right. It doesn't even resemble a beak.
Okay.
Now, what I'm saying is human artists, be it Picasso, Cubism, Van Gogh, Impressionism, and I gave the example of Henry Moore, they have, through trial and error and through intuition and genius, stumbled on the form primitives, the figural primitives, which are used by the human visual system. And then they're creating for your brain the equivalent of that long stick with the 3 red stripes for the chick's brain to more optimally titillate those visual neurons in your brain and to kick the limbic system and say, wow, okay, what a face or what an object, what a sunflower or whatever. Okay? And that's why these things don't have to resemble, even remotely resemble, what the object is that you're looking at. And that's the basis of a lot of semi-abstract art. You can do the same thing in color space and then you get a Monet. All right? But if you do it in form space, then you get Cubism and you get Henry Moore. And I have a specific explanation for Cubism too, which we don't have time to go into. And then what I have is a number of such, a list of 9 laws. That's just choice is arbitrary. Maybe there's 10, maybe there's 15, but 9 is a good place to start, which I think are universal. This is not to imply that culture doesn't play a tremendous role, but even if only 10% of art is encapsulated in these laws, it's that 10% that I'm interested in as a scientist. Because the other 90%, that's called art history. Historical trends, fads and fashions and marketing and what aspect of art is driven by the auctioneer's hammer or by, But that to me is not interesting. I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds of books written on it. It's called art history. But the 10% that's invariant, that cuts across cultural boundaries, I think one can explore on a systematic basis, find the neural basis of that, which is what Semir and others are trying to do, and go into the evolutionary rationale. So there are 3 questions about each of these laws. One is what question, what is the law, what is the functional logic, what is the logical structure, okay, of that law. 2, why does it have that form, the evolutionary why, okay. And you can see how this evolutionary question is motivated by, and it's constrained by what you know about how the visual system works. It's not just sitting in the armchair and saying, how did art evolve? Okay? And the third is the neural machinery, the how, sorry, the how question. How was it done in neurons? And you need all 3 of these in place if you want to understand any complex aspects of human psychology, whether it's music or language or art, any aspect of it. And in turn, how all of these 3 interact with culture. Okay, instead of saying, oh, it's just culture, it's just, you want to know how it all interacts. Why doesn't everybody like a Chola bronze from Indian art, or a Picasso, Cubist? If I'm right and they're titillating, it's like that stick with the 3 red stripes. Every chick likes it, whereas not everybody likes a Picasso.
But our brains aren't all absolutely identical.
Well, that's the point. The point is, I would argue, to put it even more bluntly, that we all do like Picasso, but we don't all know it. We're all in denial. In other words, there may be an early neural mechanism that signals a heightened response to the face. Picasso face, saying, wow, what a face, and hits the limbic system. But then some other mechanism kicks in, because human brains are very complicated and there are many layers. Another mechanism kicks in, maybe the left hemisphere, and says, uh-oh, you better not tell anybody you like it. It's kind of weird looking. Okay? And that actually forbids, it censors what the earlier module is signaling. And much of art appreciation involves removing these layers of indoctrination and censoring that society and culture imposes on us. So it's a slightly flipped around from your view, that you're training this person to appreciate, That may also be independently true, I'm not denying that.
Yeah, I was going to say, because most people who don't like it, they just immediately say, I don't like it.
I know, but you have to be suspicious of verbal reports.
But I mean...
See, the English who arrived in India, they looked at the Chola bronze of Parvati or celestial nymphs, and they immediately said they didn't like it. And if you probe them, they said, well, they're sort of naked women, They're Victorians, they're prudes. Okay. So the whole notion of a naked woman, being worshipped as a goddess was repugnant. So that's interfering with their artistic
So it wasn't a conscious check on that guttural appreciation or it was actually a guttural check. I mean, a limbic check on a limbic...
That's correct.
Okay, so it was generated there and stopped there.
It could very well be.
Before it even got to our consciousness.
That's correct, it could very well be.
Or our frontal cortex, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. One of the principles I said was metaphor. Now, it's good to know that, right? And you can see this in many great works of art. But knowing that doesn't mean you can immediately generate.
Right.
Okay?
Sure.
In other words,
very
I can say that the basis of poetry is metaphor.
Right.
Why is it Shakespeare is so much better at it than you or me or any computer program? So there is another ability there. So this, by the way, is different between kitsch art and great art. In great art, you are correctly exploiting those principles, okay, and doing it with great talent and genius. In kitsch, you're going through the motions of trying to apply these laws or rules, but doing it
Trying to fake it.
Right, to fake it. Another example of a principle is widely used in Indian art, and maybe in Western art too, is what I call perceptual peekaboo, or problem solving. And that is, a woman seen behind a diaphanous veil is much more attractive than a completely naked woman. And you say, well, that doesn't make sense. A naked woman is going to hit your limbic system more. Right? Not true, because what's going on is the discovery of objects, hidden objects. In other words, giving the perceptual system a challenge.
Curiosity and the completion of curiosity.
And
discovery.
And that's important, because you're up in the treetops trying to discover a mate in fog. And you have to give the system an incentive to hunt. In Indian art, in sculptures, the women wear jewelry, okay? And that's actually exploiting two principles. One is the principle of contrast, and that is the jewelry is baroque and ornate and heightens the nakedness and smoothness of her and roundness of her body, okay? The height, the contrast between jewelry, that's what jewelry on naked skin is very beautiful, okay? And often you'll find that the necklace just covers the nipple. So you're watching it, it kind of is doing a peekaboo, right? I mean,
Right.
So that's the same principle that makes you, when you discover the Dalmatian dog, say, aha, Okay, so this is why I say in my talk and in my article that one of the things artist tries to do is to create multiple ahas as the visual message cascades into the 30 visual areas. And at each stage, a signal is sent to the limbic structures, saying, aha, look here, aha, look here, aha, look here. And there is this progressive bootstrapping going on.
So you're basically setting up a domino effect to try to get the entire brain
That's correct.
up in a state of
Hyper-stimulated
frenzy.
and hyper, exactly.
But it has to be done correctly so that otherwise the connection gets lost somewhere.
That's right,
And the
exactly.
entire domino pattern is gone. And
Absolutely,
our brains,
absolutely.
we get a little, but not, okay.
That's right. And this is what the great artist does. Now, whenever I say this, some art historian will get up and say, yes, but you can put a blank canvas in front of somebody and call it art. In fact, somebody did. How do any of these laws apply to that? Well, look, there you're running into problems of definition. I mean, you can do anything and call it art, right?
Doesn't mean anybody's gonna like it.
Yeah,
Doesn't make it.
yeah. I'm trying to take a subset of what people call art, which is intelligible, and trying to discover some underlying principles. If you now say a toilet bowl is art or a blank canvas is art, okay, well then you can say perversely the opposite of art is also art.
Sure.
Fine. You know? These are questions with 10 years ago, 20 years ago you wouldn't even touch. And now you can begin to speculate on some of these issues, whether it's synesthesia or metaphor or language or even art. And
And we at least have a beginning point.
yeah,
I mean,
exactly. The first hesitant steps towards understanding some of these phenomena.
Courageous move, and I think everybody's really interested in to see where it goes. And really appreciate
Thank you.
your time.